Hello all, welcome. We'll be dealing with part 2 of the novel today, covering chapters 2 to 6. At this point, if I can give you a quick reminder that if you are finding these sessions helpful, you can hit the notifications bell in order to be alerted to episodes as and when they become available. And if you're not already, could you consider subscribing and liking this video as and where you're finding it helpful. I also want to encourage you, if you've got any questions or other comments, to do so in the comments below. It's not going to be feasible to go into huge detail for every single chapter. That's not my intention. Some will be a brief summary and overview. Other aspects will delve into more meaningful close analysis. This flowchart takes us through part 2. Chapter 2 involves Offred describing her room and preparing for a shopping trip. Chapter 3, she recalls her first meeting with the commander's wife Serena. Chapter 4 involves an encounter with Nick and a walk with Offglen, passing by a checkpoint. Chapter 5, whilst shopping, she's questioned by some curious tourists. And in Chapter 6, after shopping, Offred and Offglen take a detour to pass by the wall. While Chapter 1 was in past tense, Chapter 2 is in present. Think about the way that this novel involves a great deal of analeptic shifts. They're a little different to a flashback. A flashback does what it says on the tin. An analeptic shift can move around back and forth across several passages of time. We get these shifts whereby she thinks back to recent past and further back still to the time before. The time before is further back. She also thinks to recent past, such as the indoctrination of the Rachel and Leah Centre, the Red Centre, and also seems to be talking in present tense about some of her confinement within this regime. She now lives in a white, minimally furnished, yet traditionally feminine room, fitted with safety measures to prevent any injury, whether they be accidental or intended. The light fitting above her, the chandelier, has been removed, perhaps alluding to a suicide of a former handmaid, a hanging potentially. We're introduced to various roles within Gilead, and we meet the Marthas who work as servants for the commander and his wife. How many roles can you actually remember within this hierarchy? Challenge yourself to come up with 12. Take pause here and note down as many as you can remember. Ideally, the challenge should be meeting all of that dozen. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We will come back to that in the next slide. When overhearing them gossip, Offred longs for a platonic female relationship akin to the one that Rita and Cora the Marthas have. Platonic meaning a friendship, a close friendship. Offred prepares for a shopping trip. She collects tokens that serve as currency, ration coupons. Each token bears an image of the items, since women are forbidden from reading and writing. She's unable to buy anything outside of these parameters. In terms of the ration coupons, can you think of any other historic parallels from real life in this final bullet point? And can you also think of any other significant friendships within the novel? Again, you might want to take pause. Some of those other significant friendships might be that between Offglen and Moira in the time before and now. The ration coupons might bring to mind rationing during and in the aftermath of the Second World War, all the way up to the 1950s. And this inability to read and write, destruction of books, might evoke any number of regimes, book burning during the Second World War, and indeed some Eastern cultures' restriction of women's rights as well. So, in answer to the prior question about whether you could remember the hierarchy of roles within Gileadian society, we have eyes, angels, guardians, commanders amongst the men, and amongst the women, aunts, unwomen, wives, Jezebels, daughters, Marthas, handmaids, and econowives. Can you place these strata, this hierarchy, in an order of status? Pause for me, please. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At the base of the hierarchy, not assigned a handmaid or a woman, are the guardians. From the guardians are the select few with greater responsibility, the angels. Above them are the eyes, who seem to have a more central, informed knowledge of things like surveillance and intelligence. And above them, the commanders. There's probably some subjectivity in the hierarchy of the female roles. You might want to do a little bit of finagling of this one way or the other. Unwomen at the bottom, those who either through sexuality or race or religion or illness, special needs, cancer, radiation poisoning, have been sent to the colonies. They've been ejected from Gilead altogether. Above them, the Jezebels, prostitutes, often in this case having been forced into prostitution, but nevertheless people who've been written off as a tool for the male domineering class, the commanders, to still do morally questionable things that Gilead's regime would preach against, but in the background still very much indulging, like they might have in the time before, in misogynistic or lustful objectification of women. The Marthas in green are the servants. They are to be trusted a little more, but they are still servant class. They're too old to have children. They're not fertile. I'm not sure how I feel about the econowives being placed where it is here. These are wives of perhaps working class or middle class people who are not actually in the main strata or of the ruling class of the regime. They get multicoloured dresses. The aunts in brown are like monks. They're like nuns. They essentially are wearing habits. They are intelligent women of the time before who are bowing to this new regime to control people who need to be trained. The handmaids are coveted because of their fertility, but they are certainly not at the top of the hierarchy. They are very much mistreated by the wives through jealousy, and often referred to as promiscuous sluts, sexually promiscuous. They are in red, symbolising fertility. Atwood very much resists that she didn't have an intent in terms of some of this colour symbolism. She talks about a Dutch detergent brand being one of her inspirations. She does allude to the idea of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter also being important, given the emphasis that she places on Puritanism being a foundation of the novel. The daughters in white, purity. The wives in blue, for me, perhaps evokes Catholicism and the concept of the Virgin Mother, the Virgin Mary and Mother of Jesus. So what are the connotations of this red colour? Not just any old connotations, please. Make it relevant to the themes of the text, not violence or love, thank you kindly. Hit pause for me in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Red here symbolises fertility. The handmaid's primary function is to be fertile and create life. Consider menstrual blood and childbirth. Red is also a traditional marker of sexual sin. The femme fatale in film noir, judging from someone's revealing dress, perhaps. The handmaid's reproductive role is very much justified by the Gileadian regime, by their interpretation of biblical scripture. Remember chapter 30 verse 1 to 3 of Genesis in the opening epigraph. Does this constitute adultery? Does it constitute rape? It certainly isn't a regime that considers a concept of consent. Throughout, the wives resentfully refer to the handmaids as sluts. Again, red very much evokes an unfair resentment of a woman. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter is a 19th century novel that depicts, a couple of hundred years earlier, puritanical America of the 17th century, and looks at the mistreatment of a woman by a Puritan community who force her, wrongly, to wear a scarlet letter A, having been accused of adultery. We've also got this idea of a patriarchal, misogynistic social attitude here, whereby the woman is blamed. Consider other aspects of their uniforms as well, not just the red colour, but the wings, the white wings at the either side of their hoods, very much blinkering their peripheral vision and what symbolic relevance that might have. Blinkers, if you're unfamiliar, are sometimes attached to the harness on a horse's head so that any kind of sudden movement in their peripheral vision doesn't lead to them being startled. It's not cruel, it's something that has a practical purpose. But here, metaphorically referring to the wings of the hood as blinkers, as Offred does at one point, aside from demonstrating her way with language and intelligence, conveys the concept of restriction. She does not know the inner workings and powers that be of this regime. She is kept ignorant. There's a quotation here, "The face of a woman is a source of corruption." And I wonder whether we might also link that to some themes and parallels in the modern world. The idea of a stark traditionalism in some Middle Eastern countries, the idea of the hijab or the burqa, and whether for some cultures that is considered too controlling, or whether for other people who are choosing to do that, they consider it an important part of their faith. Night sections recur a good many times throughout the novel, and early on Offred talks about a kind of nostalgia or an indulgence in remembering small things about the time before. Perhaps this could be a kind of mental escapism or therapy, so as not to feel that she is giving in to the indoctrination of the regime. She says fairly early on, "I try not to think too much. Like other things now, thought must be rationed." Take pause for me, please, and think about what Offred actually means by this. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. For me, I think early on in the novel, by saying that thought must be rationed and that she tries not to think too much, she is not wanting to overindulge in remembrance of the time before, in case it makes her dwell resentfully so much on the restrictions of her in her current world that it drives her crazy. She goes on to change her tone markedly throughout the novel. Here early on, she resists that indulgence in nostalgic memories in case it affects her sanity. But later, the repeated night sections do become a therapeutic mental escapism for her. She embraces the idea of communicating with somebody, a generic, collective, plural listener. Note I use the term listener rather than reader, because of the revelation of transcriptions of cassettes in the historic notes. Or, ambiguously, perhaps the you is more precisely intended to be her hope for the survival of her husband and that he's still out there somewhere. She embraces that idea of communication and companionship, an audience, either her husband or a reader or listener. She doesn't know whether Luke is alive or not. She describes the mosaic-like structure of the novel, I've coined the term mosaic for this, as limping and mutilated, something that becomes more poignant given the revelations of the historic notes that the professor, Piexoto, has chopped and changed the potential order of the cassettes in order to create the tale. Often, what Offred really takes pleasure in the mental escapism of the night sections is that she is able to remember language use from the time before, even if it's the fact that the same word or phrase in the time before could have had several minor differences in its definition. Here, she recollects, "I know what you mean," we'd say, or a quaint expression you sometimes hear from older people, "I hear where you're coming from," as if the voice itself were a traveller arriving from a distant place. Now, what she's tongue-in-cheek reminiscing about here is that there would be no ambiguity in Gilead's regime. Language is totally prescribed and very rigid. There would not be sufficient ambiguity to need such a phrase as "I know what you mean" or "I hear where you're coming from." If we said to somebody now, "I hear where you're coming from," we are probably euphemising our slight disagreement with what somebody said. We're acknowledging that we appreciate their perspective, and then we're about to go on and slightly disagree with them. A bit like when we say, with all due respect, and then go on to be slightly rude. Here, though, she changes that phrase, I hear where you're coming from, to suggest that this creates the feeling of the voice being a traveller arriving from a distant place. Gilead would not, in any way, shape or form, allow an ambiguity that allows one to have to be interpreted. You are either loyal to the regime through the prescriptive language, or you are not. She's reminiscing here for a freedom that gave room for ambiguity, whereas such a thing as these phrases is now inconceivable because one would simply not use an expression open to multiple interpretations. The regime prescribes language to assert loyalty through a system of control and fear. In chapter 3, before going shopping, Offred looks around for the commander's wife but doesn't see her. She remembers arriving at the commander's house for the first time after her 2 prior assignments didn't work out due to their infertility. There's a flashback of Offred's first meeting with Serena, who tells her to stay out of the way as much as possible, and asserting that the commander is her husband permanently. Offred recognises her from the time before from a religious TV show that aired prior to the regime. The semantic field of horticulture, gardening, the flowers and produce in Serena's garden, becomes something that's metaphoric for fertility. The tulips are red, a darker crimson toward the stem, as if they have been cut and are beginning to heal there, becomes an extended metaphor. A tulip has a globe-like shape like a wine glass. It becomes representative of the wombs of the handmaids being a vessel, and the red colour again conveys the notion of menstruation and blood. Everyone is unsure about our exact status. So you're the new one. She wanted me to feel that I could not come into the home unless she said so. The wives resent the handmaids, and they want to assert their authority and make them less comfortable. Even now, there is no real money anymore. There's still a black market. As for my husband, she said, he's just that. My husband. I want that to be perfectly clear. Till death do us part. It's final. They can hit us. There's scriptural precedent for that. In chapter 4, Offred encounters Nick, chauffeur and guardian of the faith. Nick winks at Offred, a dangerously provocative gesture. She ignores him, fearing that he may be an eye, a spy assigned to test her. Offred's shopping partner Offglen arrives, and they reach a checkpoint manned by 2 guardians. At the checkpoint, Offred subtly flirts merely by making eye contact. Such is the oppression of the regime. She considers the young man's sexual frustration, unable to marry without permission, and forbidden from sinful masturbation or pornography. Guardians aim to become angels, which allows them to take a wife, and perhaps eventually a handmaid if infertile, though the regime does not acknowledge infertility can be on the part of the patriarch or the man. Up to this point, we've not heard the term handmaid used. One of the novel's central uses of imagery is introduced in this chapter: eyes. Is this a motif or a symbol? Define both terms for me, please. Hit pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Motifs, ideas, words, literary devices repeated multiple times throughout the novel, as opposed to symbols that are objects having meaning beyond the literal surface meaning. A symbol and a motif can be the same thing so long as that symbol starts to repeat itself as an extended thing throughout the text. Both develop themes here. The eye connotes a great many things: surveillance, fear, guilt, the omniscient eye of God, inescapability, power, oppression, trust and betrayal, clandestine collusion, and so on. A reading from chapter 4 then. I know this man's name. Nick. I know this because I've heard Rita and Cora talking about him, and once I heard the commander speaking to him. Nick, I won't be needing the car. He lives here, in the household, over the garage. Low status. He hasn't been issued a woman. Not even one. He doesn't rate. Some defect. Lack of connections. But he acts as if he doesn't care. He's too casual. He's not servile enough. He doesn't act like a servant. He's not a sycophant. There is something that indicates the rebel in him. It may be stupidity, but I don't think so. Smells fishy, they used to say. Or, I smell a rat. Misfit as odour. Again here, Offred is indulging in the idea in the time before that one could be ambiguous enough as to use language to say one thing but mean another. Not something that happens within the prescriptive, narrow regime of Gilead. If we move down beyond that paragraph, she talks about, despite herself, wondering how he might smell. She actually is sort of craving him, but more so than this whimsical face. She quite fancies a puff on his cigarette, and then he winks. I drop my head and turn so that the white wings hide my face, and keep walking. He's just taken a risk. But for what? What if I were to report him? Perhaps he was merely being friendly. Perhaps he saw the look on my face and mistook it for something else. Really, what I wanted was the cigarette. Perhaps it was a test to see what I would do. Perhaps he is an eye. So she actually instinctively feels that he is something of a rebel, but the paranoia that this regime's surveillance creates still leads her to assuming the worst. Moving down that page, she's left the household and she waits like a tree in a prescribed route. We get the detail that the sidewalk is made of brick, not particularly common in a United States town or city. Red brick here suggests an east, northeast, old town, in this case the university town of Boston, home to Harvard University. A shape, red with white wings around the face. A shape like mine, a nondescript woman in a red carrying basket, comes along the brick sidewalk toward me. The other handmaid, Offglen, is described in this zoomorphic way with wings, or simply as not human. She's merely a shape. There certainly is no individuality. She reaches me and we peer at each other's faces, looking down the white tunnels of cloth that enclose us. She is blinkered. She's the right one. There's nothing individual about the handmaids. And this handmaid, who is Offglen, has changed from a different Offglen not long before. Perhaps she was a rebel. Perhaps she was found out as part of the resistance movement, or some other indiscretion has led to her punishment and disappearance. Perhaps to death. Perhaps to the colonies as an unwoman. Blessed be the fruit, she says to me, the accepted greeting among us. May the Lord open, I answer. The accepted response, this very prescriptive, restrictive use of language. We turn and walk together past the large houses toward the central part of town. We aren't allowed to go there except in twos. This is supposed to be for our protection, though the notion is absurd. We're well protected already. The truth is that she is my spy as I am hers. If either of us slips through the net because of something that happens on one of our daily walks, the other will be accountable. These inner thoughts that are never expressed. This woman has been my partner for 2 weeks. I don't know what happened to the one before. On a certain day, she simply wasn't there anymore, and this one was there in her place, with the same name, because of the patronymics. It isn't the sort of thing you ask questions about, because the answers are not usually answers you want to know. Anyway, there wouldn't really be an answer. This one is a little plumper than I am. Her eyes are brown. Her name is Offglen, and that's all I know about her. She walks demurely, head down, red-gloved hands clasped in front, with short little steps like a trained pig's on its hind legs. During these walks, she has never said anything that was not strictly orthodox. But then, neither have I. She may be a real believer, a handmaid in more than name. I can't take the risk. They must both appear on the surface to be compliant, whether they agree with this regime in actuality or not. She can't take the risk of being reported by somebody who may be a real believer. Equally, we later learn she is a member of the resistance movement. The war is going well, I hear, she says. Praise be, I reply. We've been sent good weather, which I receive with joy. They've defeated more rebels since yesterday. Praise be, I say. I don't ask how she knows. What were they? Baptists. They had a stronghold in the Blue Hills. Smoked them out. Praise be. Sometimes I wish she would just shut up and let me walk in peace. But I'm ravenous for news. Any kind of news. Even if it's false news, it must mean something. Even the propaganda of the regime, which she doesn't wish to be indoctrinated by, is something that she craves if she can glean something from it. Unlike Winston in 1984, who actually produces that propaganda, she is on the periphery, unable to know. And from here, they go on to pass the checkpoint, and she speculates about the sexual frustration of the young male guardians on the checkpoint. So the semantic field of produce, horticulture, the organic world linking to fertility continues here. Here and there are worms, evidence of the fertility of the soil, caught by the sun, half dead, is paradoxical. The worms that have surfaced are caught by the sun and half dead, versus their presence being evidence of fertility. There's this kind of futility of seeking the fertility of the handmaids being reflected in the garden produce. We also get the detail that the commander has his own quarters, signifying that perhaps husband and wife are to some extent estranged, or indeed this patriarchal society that the woman keeps out of the office and isn't privy to the reading material in the office, or indeed the intelligence, the data behind the regime. The servants and security being called guardians evokes something a little bit like Orwellian newspeak, this biblical prescriptive language. Nick the chauffeur is a guardian of the faith. Some of the observances that Offred makes about him, this at least hasn't changed the way men caress good cars, perhaps clings to the past with some sexual connotations, but she bats that off as being more a desire for the cigarette. His hat at a jaunty angle, evoking the rebel. We will later learn that he is actually something like the Yiddish Evre man, somebody who is well built and good with his hands, but ready to get a gun and be part of the resistance during the night, that sort of concept. He's of low status. He's not been issued a woman. We get, by these flippant off-the-cuff remarks, some things that we can infer as a readership about the details of this society and its state-sanctioned quasi-polygamy of sorts. I mentioned in my reading already this idea of misfit as odour, the significance of phrasing of the prior times, something smelling fishy. She enjoys the ambiguity of that prior language use that she is so prohibited in doing now. The significance of the wink, not just a provocative little bit of sexual flirtation, but something that could have much more serious consequences, perhaps a test, perhaps he's an eye, evoking the fact that she's constantly weighing things up between who might be a potential compatriot to collude with versus who might be something that would make her paranoid fear all the more necessary. So you may want to consider how language is used to create a sense of not belonging or fear. One of the core questions that you might anticipate for this novel, or potentially comparing both it and Frankenstein, is how the two novels convey fear of the unknown. Other details in the chapter, the brickside walks, which are not common in the States, indicating Boston, indicating the Harvard University town. She reaches me and we peer at each other's faces, looking down white tunnels. She's the right one. There's nothing individual about these women that has been stamped out. The prescriptive greetings between the two, the pairing of the handmaids being about surveillance and spying also, and her fear that she may be totally orthodox and needs to be careful. The rest of these details I've already explored when we've looked at the section of the chapter in question. In chapter 5, Ofglen and Offred have reached a section of town that they use for shopping. They're not permitted beyond that part of the city. They wait in line at shops, and we learn the new regime is called the Republic of Gilead. We don't actually hear the term Gilead until chapter 5. We're introduced to the concept of econowives, not that they feature particularly heavily within the narrative. Offred remembers the time before when women were not protected from things such as wolf whistles or keeping a door closed to strangers. Now, as handmaids walking along, nobody in this society speaks to them at all. A handmaid in the late stages of pregnancy raises excitement that Ofglen and Offred refer to as a tremor of excitement in the store. Offred recognises her as Janine from the Red Centre, now of Warren, who was the perhaps sycophantic or perhaps most abused handmaid in the Red Centre during the testifying episode in which she accepts blame for her gang rape in the time before. Offred thinks of her husband Luke and their daughter. She remembers the prosaic, commonplace, unromantic, everyday details from their prior lives. When she's finished with shopping, Offred and Ofglen encounter a group of Japanese tourists and their interpreter. And the tourists ask, through the interpreter, if the two women are happy. And Offred replies, because she can do little else in this propagandist regime, that they are. Notice that this concept of a translator also conveys immense cultural difference. This is a white society that's eerily close to our own, and yet it's far removed from what we would consider acceptable. It might seem strange that there's such a thing as Japanese tourists. I think the concept that perhaps Atwood is alluding to here is the idea of the Gileadian regime accepting some outsiders in to try to normalise the culture. Or it might perhaps evoke some of the kind of idea of state tourism, like visiting the Amish, potentially. Some close analysis in chapter 5. In the Rachel and Leah Centre, Aunt Lydia says to the trainee handmaids, there's more than one kind of freedom. Freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, it was freedom to. Now, you are being given freedom from. Don't underrate it. According to the ants, freedom to do what you want. It might seem desirable but could lead to what they term anarchy. Freedom from rules and restrictions to protect individuals from the results of amoral or anarchic behaviour, according to the ants. Notice the semantic field of the shops. All flesh, milk and honey, marked by pictograms. That I may confirm the oath that I swore to your fathers, to give them lands flowing with milk and honey, as at this day, comes from Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 5. Within the Bible, there are 34 mentions of milk and honey, and 62 of flesh, almost all sexual in nature. Doubled, I walk the street very much conveys this motif of the doppelganger, the removal of individuality, removes the risk, at least to Gilead, of rebellion. There are no children on the streets. Where the edges are, we aren't sure. They are on the periphery of things. They wouldn't know what to do to escape. They wouldn't know how far they'd get. They're literally blinkered. I've come back to this quote from Lydia a couple of times, so I won't go back over it here at this point. In the store, they come across Offwarren, formerly Janine. One of them is vastly pregnant, swells triumphantly. She's a magic presence to us. She's described as a tremor of excitement, an object of envy and desire, both of which have connotations of sin of one kind and another. We covet her. She's a flag on a hilltop, showing us what can still be done. We too can be saved. To covet or envy something is one of the 7 deadly sins. It's very contrary to the pious aim that the handmaids actually have. There's an irony there being utilised by Atwood. The interpreter asks, "Are you happy?" because these foreign tourists consider their situation inhuman. In chapter 6, as they return from shopping, Ofglen suggests that they take the long route to past the church, their real purpose being witnessing the wall, where authorities hang the bodies of criminals executed as an example for Gileadian society. All of the 6 corpses wear signs around their necks picturing fetuses. They've been executed retroactively for performing abortions before Gilead was founded. Offred feels a strange kind of relief that none of these can possibly be her husband because he was not a doctor. Strange as that distinction may be, there's a small relief there. She thinks of Lydia telling them that they're a transitional generation and that their life will soon seem ordinary. Ordinary is what you are used to. This may not seem ordinary now, but after a time it will. It will become ordinary. For her, she will always feel the restriction. For somebody of her daughter's age, she will not know anything other than this lack of freedom unless the regime is defeated. So in chapter 5, we've had the imagery and idea of doubled I walk the street. There's no individuality between these 2 handmaids. And throughout chapter 5, we've come across the biblical allusions of the pictograms of stores like All Flesh. The regime restricts them from reading and writing, and the Japanese tourists ask if they are happy, and she can say nothing other than, yes they are, when it couldn't be further from the case. Chapter 6. A block past All Flesh, Ofglen pauses, as if hesitant about which way to go. We have a choice. We could go straight back, or we could walk the long way round. We already know which way we will take, because we always take it. I'd like to pass by the church, says Ofglen, as if piously. All right, I say, though I know as well as she does what she's really after. We walk sedately. She assumes then that Ofglen simply wants to be out of the house for a little longer. In actuality, although Offred doesn't know this yet, Ofglen is hoping to get a little bit further away for a bit more clandestine conversation, perhaps to try to drop in some terminology that shows she is not a true believer. The sun is out. In the sky there are white fluffy clouds, the kind that look like headless sheep. Given our wings, our blinkers, it's hard to look up, hard to get the full view of the sky, of anything. But we can do it, a little at a time. A quick move of the head, up and down, to the side and back. We have learned to see the world in gasps. She is so restricted. To the right, if you could walk along, there's a street that would take you down toward the river. There's a boathouse where they kept the sculls once, the rowing boats, another indication that this is a university town, Harvard, Boston, a little like the boat races that you might see annually in the UK. Some bridges, trees, green banks, where you could sit and watch the water, and the young men with their naked arms, their oars lifting into the sunlight as they played at winning. On the way to the river are the old dormitories, used for something else now, with their fairy tale turrets, painted white and gold and blue. When we think of the past, it's the beautiful things we pick out. We want to believe it was all like that. She's self-aware about the danger of nostalgia. The football stadium is down there too, where they hold the men's salvagings, as well as the football games. They still have those. A stadium has become the site of executions, hangings, stonings. I don't go to the river anymore, or over bridges, or in the subway, although there's a station right there. We're not allowed on. There are guardians now. There's no official reason for us to go down those steps, ride on the trains under the river into the main city. Why would we want to go from here to there? We'd be up to no good and they'd know it. The church is a small one of the first erected here hundreds of years ago. It isn't used anymore except as a museum. Inside it you can see paintings of women in long sombre dresses, their hair covered by white caps, and of upright men, darkly clothed and unsmiling. Our ancestors. Admission is free, an allusion there to the Puritan founding settlers. We don't go in, but stand on the path looking at the churchyard. The old gravestones are still there, weathered, eroding, with their skulls and crossed bones. Memento mori, their doe-faced angels, their winged hourglasses to remind us of the passing of mortal time, and, from a later century, their urns and willow trees for mourning. They haven't fiddled with the gravestones, or the church either. It's only the more recent history that offends them. Offglen's head is bowed, as if she's praying. She does this every time. Maybe, I think, there's someone in particular gone for her too. A man, a child. But I can't entirely believe it. I think of her as a woman for whom every act is done for show, is real rather than acting. Is acting rather than a real act, excuse me. She does such things to look good, I think. So she's constantly speculating between erring toward the desire for a compatriot who's suffering the same thing she is, with whom she could have a companionable conversation, and having to be guarded and speculating that this is all for show, to be seen to be pious and a believer. She's out to make the best of it. But that is what I must look like to her as well. How can it be otherwise? So she contradicts herself back and forth. And later we start to think perhaps that she is not pretending, but we'll come to that. Now we turn our backs to the church, and there is the thing we've in truth come to see. The wall. The wall is hundreds of years old too, or over 100 at least. Like the sidewalks, it's red brick, so it's not that old, and must once have been plain, but handsome. This again is an allusion to the real-life Harvard University. Now the gates have sentries, and there are ugly new floodlights mounted on metal posts above it, barbed wire along the bottom and broken glass set in concrete along the top. No one goes through these gates willingly. The precautions are for those trying to get out, though to make it even as far as the wall from the inside, past the electronic alarm system, would be next to impossible. Beside the main gateway there are 6 more bodies hanging by the necks, their hands tied in front of them, their heads in white bags tipped sideways on their shoulders. There must have been a men's salvaging early this morning. Executions. I didn't hear the bells. Perhaps I've become used to them. We stop together as if on signal and stand and look at the bodies. It doesn't matter if we look. We're supposed to look. This is what they are there for, hanging on the wall. Sometimes they'll be there for days until there's a new batch, so as many people as possible will have the chance to see them. What they're hanging from is hooks. The hooks have been set into the brickwork of the wall for this purpose. Not all of them are occupied. The hooks look like appliances for the armless, or steel question marks, upside down and sideways, questioning the morality of why such an atrocity would be undertaken, perhaps. It's the bags over the heads that are the worst. Worse than the faces with themselves would be. It makes the men look like dolls on which faces have not yet been painted. Like scarecrows, which in a way is what they are, since they're meant to scare. Or as if their heads are sacks, stuffed with some undifferentiated material like flour or dough. It's the obvious heaviness of the heads, their vacancy, the way gravity pulls them down, and there's no life anymore to hold them up. The heads are zeros. Though if you look and look, as we are doing, you can see the outlines of the features under the white cloth, like grey shadows. The heads are the heads of snowmen, with the coal eyes and the carrot noses fallen out. The heads are melting. But on one bag there's blood, which has seeped through the white cloth, where the mouth must have been. It makes another mouth, a small red one, like the mouths painted with thick brushes by kindergarten children. A child's idea of a smile. This smile of blood is what fixes the attention finally. These are not snowmen after all. The men wear white coats, like those worn by doctors or scientists. Doctors and scientists aren't the only ones. There are others, but they must have had a run on them this morning. Each has a placard hung around his neck to show why he has been executed. A drawing of a human fetus. They were doctors then, in the time before, when such things were legal. Abortions. Angel makers, they used to call them. Or was that something else? Even somebody as intelligent as Offred doubts herself. She's got no freedom to check, read up, hit Google. They've been turned up now by the searches through hospital records, or, more likely, since most hospitals destroyed such records once it became clear what was going to happen, by informants. Ex-nurses, perhaps, or a pair of them, since evidence from a single woman is no longer admissible. Or another doctor hoping to save his own skin, or someone already accused lashing out at an enemy, or at random in some desperate bid for safety, though informants are not always pardoned. These men, we've been told, are like war criminals. It's no excuse that what they did was legal at their time. Their crimes are retroactive. They have committed atrocities and must be made into examples for the rest, though this is hardly needed. No woman in her right mind these days would seek to prevent a birth, should she be so lucky as to conceive. So this regime makes something criminal retroactively that was not before, and punishes it even for actions at a time when the prior state didn't deem it so, in this case leading to the death penalty. What are we supposed to feel toward these bodies but hatred and scorn? This isn't what I feel. These bodies hanging on the wall are time travellers, anachronisms. They've come here from the past. What I feel toward them is blankness. What I feel is that I must not feel. What I feel is partly relief, because none of these men is Luke. Luke wasn't a doctor. Isn't. She feels this absurd relief, perhaps, to us, that these can't be her husband because he wasn't a doctor. But at the same time, she corrects her use of tense. She doesn't know whether he got across the border because of the gunshots or not. We will come to that episode later. I look at the one red smile. The red of the smile is the same as the red of the tulips in Serena Joy's garden, toward the base of the flowers where they're beginning to heal. The red is the same, but there is no connection. The tulips are not tulips of blood. The red smiles are not flowers. Neither thing makes a comment on the other, but she enjoys the freedom to do that connected thinking. The tulip is not a reason for disbelief in the hanged man, or vice versa. Each thing is valid and really there. It is through a field of such valid objects that I must pick my way, every day and in every way. I put a lot of effort into making such distinctions. I need to make them. I need to be very clear in my own mind to avoid the brainwashing. I feel a tremor in the woman beside me. Is she crying? In what way could it make her look good? So prior, in a couple of prior chapters, she has talked in chapter 4 about whether in the third page or so of chapter 4 this woman is a real believer. But here on the last page of chapter 6 we seem to get evidence that she is not devout to this regime. She is having a real reaction. These two will collude later as resistance workers. They will become compatriots, but at this stage Offred must keep her defensive barrier up and assume that she's just trying to look good. We as a reader realise that this is upset for this regime. I can't afford to know in what way it may or may not make her look good. My own hands are clenched, I note, tight around the handle of my basket. I won't give anything away. Ordinary, said Aunt Lydia, in a fairly recent analeptic shift, is what you are used to. This may not seem ordinary to you now, but after a time it will. It will become ordinary. They are the transitional generation that are having to be oppressed into an acceptance and a numbing that future generations may not even feel. We, however, as a reader, may gain a little pleasure or reassurance that Offglen does not seem to be the real believer that Offred is still paranoid and fearful of. I'll give you a little time here to dwell on these key quotations and my notes on them. I'm not going to go over them here because we've looked at this whilst looking closely at the extract in question. Do hit pause if you wish to spend some more time with these notes, otherwise we'll move on shortly. So here's a little activity to complete today that I normally would set my classes as a written activity for a homework. It might be just something that you want to make notes on or think about. Here are a couple of contradictory statements about the state of Gilead. The Republic of Gilead is protecting people from the dangers of anarchy by enforcing strict yet necessary regulations for the greater good. Or, the Republic of Gilead is restricting people's right to freedom with their totalitarian approach to religious scripture. Pick a side, please, And this allows you to argue your point of view using evidence from the novel and go back over and summarise some of the restrictive, totalitarian, dictatorial elements that we've seen depicted thus far. The wall, where the bodies of the executed are hung. The guardians, their restrictions in terms of sexual behaviour and freedoms. The eyes, the paranoid fear of surveillance. The handmaid's uniform. The need for a black market. The rules of chastity, refraining from sex, for some. Armed soldiers, a much more rigid social hierarchy than we're used to. A loss of individual identity, sexual discrimination, state control of the individual, oppression versus rebellion. That's our concluding stage for today's episode. As ever, please do hit like if it's been useful to you. That really helps me. A subscription and hitting the notification bell will allow you to be aware of new material as and when it comes up. See you next time.